And we're live, I believe. Hello, I'm Jennifer Mills. Oh dear, the app didn't load. Hello, I'm Jennifer Mills. I am the first digital writer in residence for Australia, brought to you by the South Australian Writers Centre at present. I've just been spending a month as digital writer in residence, and today is my last day. So I wanted to use this broadcast as a way of reflecting on what I've been doing and sharing with you some of the work and answering questions about it. If I can get the Q&A app to load. Pardon me for a second while I figure this out. Technology is wonderful. So this is a short story that I wrote 5 days ago, which is called Overheard. And it's a short story that I wrote composed entirely of other people's tweets. I'll just read it to you. I started something. I'm a something starter. We made eye contact in class. He remembered my name. I friended him on Facebook, and he accepted in 15 minutes. So things are looking good. What are we doing here? This is fun. This is ridiculous. What's wrong with us? So you know what's funny about that is I am actually part of a coven. I live in fear that he will somehow learn how often I visit his Facebook page. It's not that I want him to marry me, I just want him to want to marry me. So if he wants a mature relationship, how long am I supposed to wait to tell him the names of the children I've decided? Their teeth are so white, they adopted 14 kids. I'm going to teach my children to duck face instead of smile when someone says cheese. Ever since my son dropped my phone in the sink, it only takes selfies. Your children are little leaking bundles of unreasonable expectation. Got to go buy my engagement ring back before he gets back Monday. Ever talk to someone so stupid that they make you squint? I'm just a few smartphone apps away from never having to talk to anyone again. You're an introvert. You can talk to people, but you don't like to. I thought she had Tourette's, but it turns out she's just Australian. No, mi amor, es que no le quiero dar de baja al Facebook. Te doy mi contraseña. Freddy, no te enojes. You clearly cannot understand my emoticons. You obviously didn't read the liner notes. Aren't you sick of Tumblr poets? His breath smelled like failure. Language is sexually transmitted. Did you sleep with that girl? Yeah, didn't you see my Instagram? I'm really into living a really authentic life, like straight up, you know what I mean? Apparently they met on this internet thing and then she broke his heart, although I'm not sure how you do that on a computer. I probably need the internet soon because I need to Google post-structuralism. As fond as I am of you, don't forget how expendable you are. I know a lot of people I can't remember. I wonder if there's somebody out there who hates me as much as I hate you. A person can't hide their crazy. No matter what they do, it's just a matter of time before it bursts at the seams. Nothing says I'm sorry like money. She looks like someone who would write love letters to prisoners. Oh boy, I just lost touch with the present moment and went into my mind for a minute. One like, one comment. The like from herself. The comment also from herself. So that's a short story that I wrote, or actually didn't write, that I stole from other people who had stolen their lines from other people. It was a really fun process. I started out writing a short story. I had this idea to write a short story composed entirely of overheard lines from the streets of Adelaide. I have tons and tons and tons of these, and I've been working them into a short story for a long time, or a couple of months, I guess. And I still haven't found the structure of it. So then while I was fiddling around with it, I was like, hang on, what if I could get a bigger data set? What if I could just go to Twitter and use the hashtag? And so I fooled around with this, and it took probably half a day to put it together because I had a lot more things that I could use, I suppose. Yeah, the thing with overheard lines is I really enjoyed the kind of spying sense that I got from it. None of these people knew that I was using their... I'll just put the screen share back on. None of these people knew that I was using their their tweets in my story. Some of them noticed, because I favorited their tweets while I was writing it. And a couple of people gave me a bit of feedback on it, but mostly they're just strangers. And the tweets range in time from recent to about 2.5 years ago, or however long Twitter remembers things for. So I ended up chopping around all of these different human beings, and I'll never have any interaction with them, but I've stolen their thoughts. It's quite a nice process. Another story that I did is a... let me put this on, where are we? Okay, the most... definitely the most popular post that I've written while I've been on this little journey is the blog post I wrote called Mountain Animal Reader Writer. Now this actually started as a sort of essay on Twitter, which is another form that I want to talk a little bit about later. But the lovely Sarah Tooth has joined me. This is a... this is, in fact, a short story written in the form of a quiz. So Sarah Tooth will be answering the questions for me, and you can just follow along. And the quiz is called Mountain Animal. Once upon a time, there was a family who lived in a house in a street in a village beside a mountain. The mountain was pointed as though making demands on the sky. The sky was unresponsive. Your response?
I feel inexplicably sad. Or you can read them all.
No, you go ahead. People can probably read them on the screen there, I hope. The family consisted of 4 people, 2 of them children, and a small animal of the type that lived with people in those days, the type that curled itself on hearths with an eye open to check its status in the household was secure.
This story is set in a place I have never visited.
The family felt about the animal the way they felt about the mountain, which is more or less that most of its demands are unreasonable, even incomprehensible, but that they enjoyed its company. They gave the mountain and the animal a name. What do you think they chose?
The mountain's name was Henry and the animal's Elizabeth.
One day the family went walking in the mountain on some pretext, e.g. gathering mushrooms/berries. The animal followed. As the 5 of them entered the shadows of the mountain's trunk, they began to feel part of a landscape that was alive.
There were no mushrooms in the mountain's shadow.
All landscape is alive, said one of the people. But as they were the second in line, with only the animal ahead of them, the others felt no obligation to respond.
There is always an obligation.
There were tall trees against the mountain like a giant's shanty, and the howls of wild birds fell from the trees and were collected in the damp air beneath them like flies in a spider's web. The family felt
Haunted
by the sound. They entered a clearing, the animals circling. Nobody could remember how they entered the clearing or see how they might leave. It became apparent that they were lost.
Seems unlikely.
At this point, the characters began to distinguish themselves with dialogue. The dialogue took the form of
4 monologues in counterpoint.
Once each character had expressed his or her ideas about the situation through a combination of text and gesture, they realized that the animal was gone from the clearing.
If the animal can leave, the family can leave.
The family began to call the animal's name. Each of them called Elizabeth or Wolf or Conscience or Mountain Animal according to his or her personal philosophy. There was no answer, only the howl of birds in the canopy.
Those haunting birds.
They turned to each other, solid against the dark rock, for it was growing dark. The birds were restless, roosting. The family began to blame the animal. We wouldn't have come here if it wasn't for that animal, they said, and the dark rock groaned.
What about the mushrooms berries?
The mountain awoke.
Elevators.
The mountain peered through the canopy. One after another, it lifted its feet. The family held each other as crevasses appeared in the earth.
Look at the family.
The mountain began to walk. Lifting each rock foot slowly, turning its stiff trunk against the roots of trees, it displaced itself and rose. The family clung to stones for dear life.
The stones clung back.
The mountain brought the family home. It brought them right inside. It sniffed each corner of the house, then placed one foot then another on the floor in front of the fire. It turned 3 times, then it settled in the warmth from last night's embers.
Pattern.
The mountain kept one eye open to check its status in the household. The family felt that most of its demands were unreasonable, even incomprehensible, but they enjoyed its company.
After a long journey, the animal came home with a story about the mountains.
Your result is imagination. Fiction is predominantly about dragons, by which you mean metaphors, by which you mean dragons. Congratulations, all thought is language, and all language metaphor. So you see, I kind of created this this story that's also about what stories are about for people, if that makes sense. I wanted to play with this like metafictional ideas, but without being too heavy-handed. And I suppose I was sort of interested in the idea of using a quiz because it's so banal and such a non-literary form. we tend to use it for, you know, women's magazines. It sort of resonates with Facebook and these really like low culture sort of forms. So I guess I was sort of trying to rescue this format for a literary purpose. The story itself is kind of silly, but I really like that about it. But the element of, it's interesting doing it live actually, because the element of the question and answer actually creates this extra resonance for it live. So you've got sort of, I guess, almost like a song going back and forth between two voices. And having just done that with Sarah here, I'm actually thinking, oh, I want to do this again, and I want to play a different game, and I want to make it harder.
Yeah. Real games.
Yeah. So that was kind of the quiz, and then the WordPress people found that post and blogged it on their little collection of things to look out for this week on WordPress. And so from that, I've had hundreds of emails, and the poor writer said has had hundreds of emails of people liking that post and reblogging that post and stuff. So that's built a lot of the audience for this blog as well, I think, which has been quite nice. I'm just going to leave the screen share on because it's much nicer than looking at my own face. I wanted to talk a little bit about the very beginnings of the residency. I was reading back over this post this morning when I was thinking about what I was going to talk about this evening. And it was very interesting looking at what I thought I was going to do and comparing it with what I have actually done. This is always true of a residency, and it's always true of a writing project, any kind of writing project, which is part of the fun of writing and part of the difficulty of funding applications and the life of being a writer, where you have to be, to a degree, predictable in your behaviour for the purposes of filling out forms for people that want to give you money if you fill out the right forms. So initially on paper, I thought that this residency would be in sort of two halves. One half was as a sort of experimental lab residency, which is me mucking around with digital forms and figuring out what the possibilities are of writing fiction using Twitter and writing fiction using various other formats. And the other half is outreach project. So that's being an accessible person, blogging, but also building sort of participation, particularly with South Australian regional writers. I think the second half was in many ways less successful over the month. Possibly because my other blog, my normal blog, gengen.com.au, already has kind of a voice about my day-to-day work, and that's where I sort of vent about industry stuff and my writing process a little bit more, and I didn't really want to repeat myself, and I felt like this new project was an opportunity to do something a bit different. I also found that with my Twitter feed, because if you look at the first thing that I tweeted, it was about finding my voice again. I have to scroll all the way down, back through 500 tweets, if you bear with me. But it was really just like starting from scratch again in a new place and figuring out, well, where am I going to hang my pictures and how am I going to live in this little room? And now from the other end, I'm sort of got my bags packed in the hallway and I'm ready to move back to Mills Gen. but this sort of feels like home now. So it's quite funny. Where is it? So many theories. Just bear with me. So, lots of being excited about things. Yeah. It's funny how much this feels like starting Twitter all over again. Awkward first steps, finding the right voice. It's what starting a new story feels like, except you're doing it in public. So that's kind of, yeah, taking on this new role was sort of about taking on a new voice for me and trying on a new hat, which has been a really excellent opportunity. But it has meant that I've done less of that talking shop stuff. On the other hand, we have learnt how to use Google Hangouts at the South Australian Writers' Centre, and there's possibilities of using these for workshops, discussions, and readings and stuff like that in the future. This is my first live reading / performance / talk on YouTube. You will notice that I'm hiding my face with screenshots quite a lot because I find it a bit disorienting being on screen. But it's totally a learning curve for me as well, and I can imagine myself sort of participating in future discussions in this way. So in that sense, it's definitely been a kind of a good outreach process. I guess in terms of that overlap as well with my other work, I didn't really want to overlap too much with what the Writers' Centre already does well, which is all that stuff about building communities and building enthusiasm for writing and connecting writers up with other writers. So my focus has probably been on the experimental stuff. As well, that's there's something also about participation that I think is quite tricky with new stuff, where if you're trying to build a new kind of project and nobody really knows what shape it's going to take yet, and I'm sort of making things up as I go along, it's very slow to build an audience for that and build a sense of confidence for people to participate in it. So in a sense, I've been taking on a degree of the risk creatively in order to create something that has a shape that people can then build on in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think people have been a little bit shy to participate, which is quite funny for the internet, because I don't think of my Twitter comrades as particularly shy people. And I guess that the conversations on Twitter that have been more participatory have been more free and easy, more of that sort of discussion about ideas and things that Twitter does very naturally, rather than a couple of times I've done call-outs for people to send me stuff, like send me something you've overheard or that kind of thing, and it's been quiet, trying to get people to sort of jump in, and I'm not sure why that is. I think it's one of those things with the digital space as well, that you can never sort of impose, I don't know, you can never like build something that's going to do what you want it to, essentially. Everything has a sort of force of its own, or people have a force of their own, maybe. I don't know that I'm really explaining that very well. I'd really like some questions, if anyone's got any questions. It turns out that I can't turn the Q&A on in the Hangout on air because I have to turn it on before the broadcast begins. So So I won't be making that mistake again. And I'll just go back in time 27 minutes and fix that.
So you're not getting the.
I can't get comments on the. Yeah, can't get Q&A on the Hangout. But I can still get Q&A on Twitter. Just have a moment of dead air while I refresh my feed. So what have we done? The quiz. Yeah, so the other thing that I said I was going to do that I actually did was taking some time to reflect on what living on the internet feels like and whether it's changed how I write and what I read and the way I think about storytelling. So I've sort of been using this Twitter feed as a very loose essay form. This kind of evolved naturally. I just started talking about tweeting, essentially. I just started writing and then figured out what happened next. Which is quite often how I write anyway. I just sit down and start writing and then see what happens. Often I have like an image or an idea in my head first, but usually I don't have a sense of what shape it's going to be or the sentences are going to be or anything. So I just started writing about social media and performance, identity, privilege, these sorts of things, ghosts. And so after a little while I built this kind of voice, I suppose, for the residency, which was very thoughtful and considered and tends to talk in sort of 15 to 20 tweets in a row in a broadcasty kind of a way, but that's interactive, but much more in the way that I would if I was in a actual live talking about writing situation where I'd just rant about a subject until someone interrupted me, essentially. So these stories have been kind of, these little essays kind of came as a really natural way of writing, and that wasn't something that I thought of as an experiment, but reflecting back on the residency now, that's actually that revealed itself as like the dominant form of the residency for me, is writing these almost ad-libbed essays on Twitter and then storifying them using Storify, which, if you're not familiar with, here's an example of somebody else's Storify, which I was part of. And it's just a piece of software that allows you to quote other people's tweets and rearrange them. And then you can comment on them afterwards if you like. And you can also add text in between and that sort of thing. So some of these discussions that I took part in ended up on Storify as a sort of a record of a conversation. I've always found Storify before this residency, I always found it kind of awkward to work with, but it seems to be a really natural fit to this kind of residency format because I'm sort of exploring these ideas that are new to me, and then exploring them live is a way of, I guess, getting other people's like you build your work socially. You don't build your work alone anymore, which is very different to the way that I would normally write, which is that I would do everything alone and then share it with people when it's fixed, when it's finished and done. Yeah, so I guess there's that element of added risk as well here. But it's been really, really fun having these kind of conversations. So here's another one. This started as a conversation about thing in The Guardian about how technology shredded attention spans have doomed the novel. And then there was a conversation between several writers and readers about what this is really about, and are writers really afraid of the internet because they're afraid of interacting with their readers or being held accountable by their readers, and what then that built into what are readers and what are writers, and what's the difference between those two, and how are those roles changing with the internet. And actually the ideas around the quiz that I wrote came a lot out of this conversation. There's a picture of my breakfast to prove that Twitter is destroying all complex thought. So yeah, Storify as a tool has kind of come into its own for me now, right, as a non-fiction tool. But I also used it to write the Overheard story. And it was perfect for doing that because it's a tool that allows you to essentially rearrange things visually, more or less the same way that I would at home if I was writing a story that was fragmented and I had things written on cards or on scraps of paper, and I would spread them out on the floor or on a desk or a table and physically rearrange them. It's the same kind of deal, so that's quite handy.
Mara Breeze has a question.
I have a question. How much history are you aware of in terms of digital writers in general, and has this informed your residency practice in any way? Very little, actually. My main encounters with digital writing, quote unquote, have been through my own reading of literary journals, I suppose. There was a, I'm going to have to Google it because I didn't bookmark it. Was it electronic? I'm the fiction editor at Overland, and there was a edition of Overland which was an electronic poetry edition, which is where I came across a few of the people that, I see the person that asked the question is on this. This is where I came across quite a few digital writers. This was edited by Benjamin Laird. I really got excited about all this stuff. When I was a kid, though, I was a bit of a nerd. I have two older brothers who are both nerds, and they were into like choose your own adventure and role playing and stuff like that. So I would sort of get dragged around to whatever the latest nerd fad was. And my dad had like a 286 that he got from work, and we all got very excited that he had a computer. And when bulletin boards started up, my brothers were like dialing up to bulletin boards, and they would have these text-based games, or they were game stories essentially, where you would have a line of text and then you would type in what your answer was, and sometimes the computer would just go, I don't know what you're saying, and sometimes it would lead you to the next magical room, and that was sort of an extension of the choose your own adventure world for me. And so I remember sitting there, I must have been sort of 12 or something at this stage, and being really amazed by this phenomenon that a story could actually talk back to you. And those, what's it called, that like Turing test kind of software that pretends to be a psychotherapist, or it pretends to be a... Yeah,
basically interactive.
Yeah. And so you're sitting there going, oh my god, it's just like it's human. But of course it's not. Very impressive in monochrome on a 286 when you're 12. And then after that, I guess a lot of that stuff disappeared for me.
when I grew up, and I got excited about books for adults and stopped reading books that you had to roll a dice to proceed. And I think that, yeah, my interest in sort of mainstream literary fiction eclipsed a lot of that quirky interest. And then I came back around as I got older and more interested in anarchism and situationism and these kind of, I guess, ways of deconstructing texts and ways of cutting things up and pasting them back together and stuff like that. And so I developed an interest in détoulement and that kind of movement, and then I found my way back to more experimental fiction. Which is not to say that experimental fiction is my thing at all. I'm still like a quote-unquote normal writer. But this residency has really kind of ignited an interest in it, which I think is not going to go away now. Does that answer your question?
There's another question about issues of copyright when you're collating other people's, tweets.
Yeah, well,
Storify. I mean, obviously it doesn't have sort of legal copyright, but I guess that there's, possibly.
Absolutely. With the overheard story, I'll never publish this apart from in the format that it's in. I wouldn't be able to put that in a book unless I got permission from each person in it to use their tweet in my story in my print book. But that's kind of ridiculous at the same time because none of these people got permission from the person who they overheard talking in the street to write down what they were saying and put it on the internet. So the internet kind of decimates that old sense of what's private and what belongs to you. I notice with teenagers and with most people under 25 don't have the same sense of privacy as people over 35 do. And I'm on the cusp sort of thing of this generation, so I can sort of see both sides of it. But I guess that notion of like what I would call oversharing, a teenager would call normal life, would call being themselves. And so you have these kind of fuzzy boundaries around property and intellectual property, which obviously corporations are taking advantage of. But I did write about this a little bit when I posted the overheard thing, because I was really interested in the way that people sort of the way that people report on each other. And this kind of culture, the social media is the ultimate panopticon, really. Like, we're all reporting on ourselves constantly. And we're all sort of complicit in this system of recording human beings and recording each other, reporting on each other. And in some ways it's super sinister. I find it super frightening. Like, I've never been on Facebook, partly for that reason, but then I'm on Twitter, and essentially it's the same thing that's happening. But I don't know, I guess maybe Twitter's just more comfortable for me because I'm writing, and that's my natural form of inventing myself. But yeah, I'd never be able to publish that story in a journal or anything like that. It was really just a moment of sort of voyeuristic theft.
But you can publish it on Storify?
Yeah.
That's all right, do you think? Like,
yeah,
in terms of I guess it's more about where where your moral stand, isn't
The
it, on
ethics-
copyright? And
Yeah, the ethics are mildly dubious, but I don't think that they're like Storify doesn't steal. The people whose tweets those were, the authors. They're still the authors of those tweets.
yeah, that's right.
These
And
human beings.
it doesn't monetize or commercialise the.
No.
I did notice off topic though that the Saturday paper when it launched, we're running 4-page ads with sort of notable people's tweets. Did you see those?
No.
4 pages, like Annabelle Crabb had tweeted, "Oh wow, the new Saturday paper's launched," and there would be a full page, and they didn't know. They were just having those tweets taken and put into their newspaper. So apparently that's all right, copyright-wise. So I think it's funny. Mel does mention here about the copyleft models and those kind of, I guess, sort of piracy party approaches to
Yeah, and
copyright.
Creative Commons kind of stuff, which I have had some of my products, for want of a better word, are on Creative Commons online, but mostly photographs and stuff like that. But yeah, the ethics around that and digital writing are complex, I guess, and they're very different to what the situation is for a traditional author. So coming from being a traditional author to experimenting with this stuff, I guess it's been in the back of my mind a little bit, but I tend to err on the side of not stealing, I hope. I don't know, I think that the internet and creativity in general really disrupts the idea of private property and intellectual property in particular. And you're seeing that now with threats to authors' rights. And so authors are always in this really tricky position where we either defend traditional copyright, which are not necessarily working for us, or we bow down and let everything that we make be stolen. And so I think most of us are kind of stuck in this little bubble of ignorance and just pretend it isn't there and want it to go away.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some really interesting conversations. I know the ASA Congress last year, they had a panel on this, and somebody from the Australian Digital Alliance, the woman's name escapes me now, and they're the people who put together the case to in favour of changing our Copyright Act and to fair use. So sort of, and she has an excellent presentation where it's all about, your kids dress up to go to a teddy bear's picnic, copyright infringement, singing happy birthday, copyright infringement, the kind of logical extension of the Copyright Act as it exists now. But there was an interesting panel of people, Angelo Lukakis representing from the ASA, the other extreme, sort of more traditional author approach, and it's a great conversation to have, and we're trying to bring, I know all writers' centres are trying to, bring those conversations more into the public space, but sometimes they're things, I find that writers often, if they're not working in the digital space, they're often not interested very much in copyright until their copyright gets infringed.
Yeah.
And then suddenly people are very interested.
It's like men and consent.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think that stuff's really, it's very true that most authors just kind of pretend it isn't there and hope it goes away. It feels a little bit like learning business stuff, and it also feels a little bit like the enemy of creativity when you start worrying about that stuff too much, because let me just go back to that blog post for a second. Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal, bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. So the natural role of the author is to steal. The natural kind of mentality that you're in when you're writing is you have to borrow and nick. Like you nick images and you shoplift sort of overheard words in a shop, and you pick up flotsam and jetsam in your daily life, and that's what you craft stories from. So you can't really be too precious about ownership or permission, you know. I realized at a very early stage in my writing career that nobody was going to come and give me permission to do what I do, that I would just have to give myself permission to do it. So I guess there's that as well. Any final questions before I wrap this up? Before I do, I just wanted to point you to the other story that I made using Twine, which is, oh, not here. Which is speaking back to Choose Your Own Adventure. This is using a piece of software called Twine, and this is a story that I remixed sort of from my own story, I guess. And it's, you can choose your own adventure where you go with it. I won't give away the trick here, but go and have a play around with it. That one hasn't got as much attention as the other ones that I've written, and I'm not sure why. I think maybe because it's a little more dense. And possibly a little more familiar. It was based on an original short story that I reshaped to fit into this. Actually, I'd always written it to be a particular shape, and I found a way to do it with technology. So yeah, have a play with that one. It is linked from the blog at It Is Time. And going back to time, today, ooh, I wonder if we're going to create a loop.
Oh, nice.
What happens if I play? Today I wrote a series of tweets about time which emerged as an essay. And I wanted to mention as well that as the residency progressed, I started to get more formal about the way that I wrote these Twitter essays and less random. So this one was actually written as a Word document full of tweets that I then posted but edited as I went and rearranged as I went. So I was rewriting them in Twitter. So it was sort of a rough draft to first draft kind of process. And posting the whole thing took an hour and 40 minutes, and at the end of it I was completely exhausted. And I thought, I was thinking about the way that Twitter, and particularly this digital residency Twitter, has been quite a lot like a live performance itself. It's been taking on a different character and playing a role and putting on a voice. I've really enjoyed doing that, and I'm kind of looking forward to going back into my old costume as well. But unlike live performance, when you go back with Storify, you have the possibility of refining the structure and annotating the text. So here's an example of an annotation that I've added in Storify afterwards. I added a couple of links that I didn't have at the time that I was tweeting. And this was a very complex conversation about the nature of time, and something that I've been thinking about for the last 4 years, writing a book about it. So just wanted to direct you to that kind of stuff. I'm going to write another blog post reflecting on what this residency has done to my head when I've had a bit more time to think about it. But I just want to thank Sarah and the South Australian Writers Centre for the opportunity to do this. It's been really fascinating for me, at least, and I hope for some of you.
And we would like to thank you so much. It's been obviously a genuine experiment. This is something really new, and where none of us had certainly toyed with rotational accounts or blogs or those kind of things organisationally before, none of the Writers' Centres. So it's been really incredible to see where Jennifer's taken this and how the centre will be able to build on some of these outcomes, some of which we already have some outcomes, but more of that later. I would encourage writers who have engaged with this process to contact their own state-based writers' centre if you're interested in being involved. We would thank, of course, the Australia Council who funded this through a special initiatives, and we will, and that's for this year, but we'll be hoping that this continues on, and we've got a number of ideas of ways that this will continue on into the future. So please do contact your local writers' centres if you're interested in taking part and being involved, and stay tuned for Writer in Residence number 2, but we'll miss you, Jennifer. Yes, there we go.
Yeah.
And I shall miss this adventure, but I'm sure it will trickle down into my other work in whatever way. All right, that's it.
Thank you.
Good night, thank you.